So listen, we're talking about Urban Peak. We're talking about predominantly young people who are unhoused in the Denver metro area. And as I mentioned, it's just it's a complicated issue and something you have to deal with every day. So let's talk about some of the root causes. And in the course of a young person's life, do you see windows of opportunity somewhere along the line? Is it in middle school? Is it in high school? Where are these inflection points where you think some effort might make a difference in steering these young folks in a different direction? Or is that even not a thing?
Boy, that's a big question. Let's see what I can do with that. So I think a lot of times what I heard you saying in the introduction was that stigma around when we see people unhoused or who are experiencing homelessness, we're really quick to think, what's wrong with you? What did you do? Why aren't you doing these things? And I was in a class last week, and a guy who's been involved in working with youth experiencing homelessness for decades said, no one when they're 12, it's like, ooh, I'm going to grow up and I'm going to be homeless. Like, that's the game. And when we think about folks that we see on the streets and people say, oh, well, they won't engage in systems, they won't get help, all of that is, I think, a really important reframe is that these are folks whose systems have failed them their whole lives. And so why should they engage in systems that have failed them? And I think that reframe is really important.
So it's a trust issue.
Yeah.
So it's about...
and trauma. It's trust and trauma.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
And there was an interesting article that I read, I think it was in the New York Times Sunday Magazine a couple months ago about a doctor who was graduated from Harvard Medical School and tried to do 1 year of treating homeless population in Boston, and it ended up being his entire career.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah, he's amazing.
Yeah.
And his there's no way to summarize his approach other than to say it was important to him to learn the names of all the people he was dealing with.
Yeah.
That was a great first step.
Yeah, I think so. In Denver, we're very hot in a mayoral race, and I had one of the candidates say, what are we missing in the conversation? And I just feel like we're missing that we're talking about people. We're talking about people with names, we're talking about people with experiences, we're talking about people with families, and we have to always go back to people, because for people experiencing homelessness or the unhoused or whatever language we want to use, it's a really complicated issue because humans are really complicated, and that it doesn't mean we can't solve it. It doesn't mean we can't make that change. Like, at the end of the day, while sarcastic, I am a Pollyanna, and I know that we can solve this challenge. We just have to decide to do it one person at a time.
Yeah. We tried something a couple years ago that I think was a success, even though it was tough, which was a music program with a group of formerly homeless young people between the ages of 18 and 24. No, I think 18 and 22. But in any event, these were folks who had been on the street, recently found housing. We gave them free instruments, we gave them instruction, we gave them mentoring, we helped them write songs, we got them in the recording studio to record their songs.
Yeah.
And even though we were very hands-on and very available, we had more than a 50% attrition rate where folks couldn't stay with the program or had a very hard time showing up for appointments and when I did get to work with these folks and help them translate their stories into songs, you're exactly right. There was a lot of trauma. There was almost always some family trauma, some judgment, some violence, something there at the root cause, but it didn't keep them from having great stories to tell and great poetry and passion. But it didn't necessarily feel like we helped a lot. I want to think that we did because we gave away a lot of instruments and we helped them see the possibility of making music in their lives regularly. Yeah. But it was interesting to try and not know whether we're making a difference, and I'm sure you experienced that.
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning you asked me a question around root causes, and I think there are always a million causes that can get anybody in any situation in life. But for youth, there are some trends that we see, and first is really around family instability. And so that's just another term for poverty. And then foster care youth. 1 out of 3 foster care youth become homeless on the day they turn 18, and 2 out of 3 in 9 months. And then LGBTQ youth make up about another 35% nationally of youth who are experiencing homelessness. And so to tie it back to what you're saying is that it's not just one moment. You never know what the impact is going to be. And I mean, as a 19-year-old, I was pretty flaky, and I had a lot of resources and a lot of supports, and I was stably housed and all of those things, and I still probably didn't show up 50% of the time. And so I think, I mean, I know I didn't, so it wasn't, I've come a long way. I'm like there 90% of the time now. But, I think that piece is really important as we think about that, is to remember that we're talking about teenagers, and we're talking about people whose brains are developing and have experienced so much trauma and so little lack of connection that, it's a great story about a man that works with us who did outreach. So the same as that story that you read in the New York Times, going out on the street and meeting people where they are and connecting with them. He tells a story about that he met a young person on the street, and that young person didn't tell him his name for 6 meetings, and didn't tell him his real name until they'd met 12 times, and didn't tell him his date of birth till they'd met 18 times. And so I think that piece around consistency and showing up and just being there, and you never know.
Yeah. So compassion is a huge part. Trust is a huge part. Another thing that I'm sure you're dealing with is different kind of drugs these days.
Yeah.
And as I understand it, there was a homeless young person who died right outside your facility in Denver a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
On the streets.
Yeah, fentanyl is no joke. I mean, I think that I think the combination of COVID and fentanyl and the just, huge inequality and wealth gap and lack of affordable housing, it's sort of this perfect storm. And there's a lot of folks that are like, I can't believe it's so bad right now. It must be because of this thing. And we got to get real with ourselves, is that this is decades upon decades upon decades of ignoring our most vulnerable and our most high-risk folks, and saying to people who are living in poverty, you better do these things we can't do for ourselves, but you're poor, so we have that expectation of you. And now, year after year after year, we've hit a tipping point and a crisis, and that I don't think we can say it's just this one thing.
Yeah.
But fentanyl and the lack of access to appropriate substance misuse treatment and appropriate mental health services is devastating. And until we are really ready to invest and think creatively and break a system apart that is failing the most vulnerable among us, we will just continue to see it. And one of the things I'm really proud about what we do at Urban Peak, and I often say that we are the merry band of misfits. If I was in a band, I might name it that, because I was like, but if, as we think about that, we believe that it is not our job to save these young people's lives. It is our job to be partners with them and to be support systems to them, and they deserve so much better than what they're getting.
Speaking of deserving and getting so much better, I understand you're starting a new facility.
Yeah,
Mothership. It's a campus.
It's a campus.
Mothership, 130 beds or something like that?
So,
And,
yeah. It's awesome. Yeah.
Because housing is a huge step for any kind of intervention, right?
Yeah. So the mothership, well, first the name came about as a joke, because all good things start as a joke. I thought if we called it that, then if some really rich person wanted to give us a lot of money, we could name it after them instead. But the name has stuck, and I have to say it is sort of hilarious to like have the mayor of Denver be like, the mothership. I'm like, oh. Or Congresswoman DeGette say, oh, we're so proud of the mothership. I'm like, oh, that's great. I mean, it's sort of amazing. But the campus itself.
It could have been so much worse, actually.
I know. I said it was because it was the mother of all projects.
Yeah.
Like, so. Anyway, so the campus itself is really innovative, and that's what I'm speaking to is this, where is that gap between congregate shelter, which if you've been in the provider world or if you're experiencing homelessness, congregate shelter is terrible. And I think COVID hit and everyone was like, oh yeah, congregate shelter is bad. And then independent housing, and we need skills for independent housing, particularly youth. I mean, I tell this story all the time, that there was a young woman who moved into an apartment at Urban Peak right after she was 18. She had been in 17 placements while in the foster care system. And she stored her sweaters in her oven. And I was like, oh my God, it's gonna burn the building down. Like, that is a big problem. And she said, I've never had an oven. I've never had access to an oven. And I wanted my home to be clean and tidy. And it was this sort of moment for me of like, okay, what are we doing wrong here? Yeah. What do we need to build? And so the mothership is this really comprehensive campus that's gonna have shelter. It's gonna have what we call neighborhoods, which are very much like college suites, so shared living and dining, shared community space. There's a case manager office. I joke that it's the RA's office. And that we can do it, we can have those neighborhoods by affinity groups, so we can have pregnant and parenting youth in a neighborhood. We can have youth with really significant intellectual developmental delays, and we can have a recovery neighborhood. And then all of our support services will be on site. So education, employment, workforce development, a medical clinic, clinicians, case management. And it's this really innovative, crazy thing where we can wrap young people in services and in community that I think probably many of us in this room had, and that we can provide it.
Yeah.
And nobody's doing anything like that in the country. And we're really the first, and it's really exciting.
That's exciting.
I have these nightmares right now that it won't work. Yeah. I wake up, I'm like, oh God, I hope it works. It's gonna work.
If people want to learn more about what you're up to, urbanpeak.org, right?
Yep.
Urban Peak, P-E-A-K, urbanpeak.org.
And there are also really good resources in various communities. Like Together here in Boulder does really good work. There are lots of places all over, and so I think that it's really important to find in your community who's doing the work.
And I think in the spirit of John Prine's song Hello in There and other songs, that there is an opportunity for us to reframe how we see unhoused people, homeless people of any age.
Yeah.
And to your point, remember that they're people.
I give a piece of advice always to my kids. I always like to end when we talk about this is people often say, like, well, what can I do if you see that person on a street corner? Do you give them water? Do you give them a granola bar? Do you give them money? And there is no perfect answer. I think you do what is right for you. But what I would say to you and everyone else is, like, don't look away. You know, you don't have to give money. You don't have to give granola bars or whatever it is. But if we don't look at folks and we look away, they become invisible, and there is so much pain and darkness in the invisibility. So it doesn't mean you have to step in and de-escalate or get into a situation you don't know, but don't look away.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Christina. Thank you so much. That's Christina Carlson, who's the CEO of Urban Peak down in Denver.